He sees God as an activist God. A God who works in history and time. Who actually shapes historical events for his own purposes. And specifically, to deal with his people. Remember, some weeks ago we were looking at the book of Ephesians and how Paul talked about how God has exalted his Son, Jesus Christ, to be head over all things for the church. And what we saw is that while Christ has dominion over the heavens and the earth, and all the nations of the earth, it's all for the sake of the church. God has in mind his people. And so the movements of history and time are for their benefit. They are shaped and defined for them. They are what count in Scripture. And so God is an activist God. He works in time, He works in history to accomplish His purposes and to deal with His people. In this particular circumstance, He's going to reveal to David the reason for this drought. And it has nothing to do with something that David himself had done. Although perhaps it reflects the fact that David did nothing in this regard. But it has to do instead with King Saul and something that he did some years ago. God tells David that King Saul had conducted a slaughter of the Gibeonites. If we were describing this in modern language, in the lingo of our contemporary day, we would say that Saul was engaged in ethnic cleansing. He was trying to purge the nation Israel of those elements in its midst that were not racially pure. These were the Amorites, the citizens who were originally in the land of Canaan when Israel crossed the Jordan. And you may recall the story that as they crossed, the Gibeonites deceived the Israelites and Joshua by sending a team of men who presented themselves as having gone on a long journey. And they had worn out clothing and dried out bread and so forth. And they said, "We are your servants from a distant nation. We've heard of your great power, and we want to make peace." And Joshua, rather than consulting the Lord first, assumed that he understood the situation and made a covenant with them, not realizing that in fact they lived within the land of Canaan that he was told and obligated to wipe out. So a moral dilemma now faced Joshua and that community. And ever since then, God held His people accountable in the sense that they were to observe this covenant with the Gibeonites. They were now to protect these Gentiles in their midst. I think in some ways God is anticipating a gospel work of Christ that would extend to the nations of the earth. We would find a home within the house of Israel. We would become Israel through faith in Jesus Christ. But here God notes that Saul, in violation of this covenant, began to wipe these Gibeonites out. Why? We don't have an account of it in the historical record. We don't know exactly what took place. But the speculation is that after, you recall, Saul went into battle against the Amalekites. And he didn't kill them all, as he was told to by Samuel the prophet, but spared Agag and some others. That after that unfortunate event, where Saul failed to fulfill his covenant responsibilities and had the prophecy of the kingdom being taken away from him, Saul tried to remedy things by taking matters into his own hands and going to the Gibeonites, another Gentile community, and showing his great zeal for Israel and Judah by trying to wipe them out. So win once more the favor of Israel and Judah and try to once more establish his dominion. That may have been the historical background behind this event. In any case, David is presented with this national crime. And David is now obligated to seek a remedy. And so he goes to the Gibeonites themselves, those who had survived this attack. And he asks them what must be done to remedy the issue. Now, the story at this point is a rather human story. It's a story of conflict, of individuals locking horns with each other, of offenses being taken. And now David does what we need to do in going to try to seek a remedy. He goes to the offended partner and asks them what must be done to make amends. Now that's the language of the New International Version, in the 3rd verse. He asks them what must we do to make amends. The New American Standard, I think, follows the Hebrew text a little bit more carefully. What must we do to atone for what has taken place? It's atonement that David is after. Finding a way to propitiate wrath, to take wrath away, to find peace through sacrifice. What must be done? And the Gibeonites give David a remedy. And it's a remedy that we would look at and would probably shudder at. What kind of remedy is this? A rather bloodthirsty remedy. After all, after these many years, however many they are, Saul is already dead. The one who perpetrated the crimes is dead. What further punishment can we bring on Saul? Well, the Gibeonites say, we don't want a financial payout, which was one way in which these kinds of things were handled in the Middle East. And they said, we don't want either just to kill Israelites in general, and we don't have authority to take those actions in and of ourselves. And so David prods them and says, okay, well, what do you want me to do? How can we find a solution? And they say, well, take 7 of Saul's sons and give them over to us, and we will kill them and expose them before the Lord on a hill in Gibeah of Saul, the Lord's chosen one. What? You're going to take 7 of Saul's sons and execute them for something that they themselves didn't do? How can you accept that? Modern audiences looking at this might be troubled by this. However, there are a number of things that we need to keep in mind. One of which is that it's quite possible that these sons of Saul also took part in the pogrom, took part in the devastation, the killing of the Gibeonites. And so they may have had a hand in it, and what is more, they may have benefited from the results of all this. So there is this consequence that they must bear. They shared in the responsibility of that event. And so now they must pay the penalty. And so there is that. There's also the fact that a covenant was broken. In Near Eastern treaties of the day, these actions are consistent with what you find in the Near East. As scholars take a look at these kinds of things, this is the way broken treaties were resolved. The offending party was cut up and executed. Now, the historian tells us these things because he has, I think, bigger things in mind. There is a reason why these stories are placed in Scripture. If I were a secular historian, I might not think much of this event. I might have passed it over because there does not seem to be much historical significance to it from my mind. But the historian sees a different purpose in mind.